Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Child Anxiety FAQ podcast. FAQ stands for Frequently Asked Questions, and I'm answering listener questions about child and teen anxiety. My name is Dawn Friedman, and I've been working with kids and families for more than 3 decades as a preschool teacher, parent educator, family case manager, clinical counselor, and now as the owner and operator of Child Anxiety Support, where I help parents of anxious kids. And this episode's question is, why shouldn't I ask my anxious child why they're anxious? And as you can probably tell, this is a more complicated question than that. So let me tell you what it came out of. Lots of times when I am working with parents of anxious kids, we start talking about why their child is anxious because sometimes there's a reason. Sometimes a child is anxious about school because they have a problem with the teacher. Sometimes kids are anxious about being left at a grandparent's because they had to do that before because a family member was sick and it was tied up in all of that. Sometimes a child is anxious about walking down the street where there's a barking dog because they've had a big dog jump on them and scare them before. And that's why we ask why. But sometimes we parents of anxious kids get really hung up on the whys. The truth is, those of us who have anxious brains are sometimes just anxious. And sometimes getting hung up on the why behind anxiety can actually perpetuate the anxiety. When you have a child who has anxiety, that anxiety can come out in a lot of ways, including sometimes dysregulated behavior. And if we have a child who is anxious, and if we then see dysregulated behavior, it stands to reason we would say, my child is behaving in this way, and I think it's because of anxiety. Or sometimes, if our child is struggling with dysregulated behavior, even if they're not anxious, our first question is to ask why. Sometimes that's a really good question to ask. We have shifted to a parenting culture that recognizes that children do not always have the capacity to say, this is how I'm feeling, this is what is happening. And instead, they show us in their behavior. They show us through sometimes behavior we don't like, sometimes hitting, kicking, yelling, back talk, whining, crying, all of those things. And it is good to think about the why behind the behavior. However, like with anxiety in other contexts, sometimes we get too hung up on the why. Sometimes there is no why, not a clear A to B kind of why. Sometimes the why is more obscure, like it was raining and I don't like it when it rains, or school was a little much today, or I'm coming down with a cold. Or when it comes to kids, a lot of the times we see dysregulated behavior when they're about to go through a growth spurt or are going through a growth spurt, not just physically, but emotionally, developmentally, academically. So when kids are growing, we can expect some dysregulated behavior. This is all to say that my feelings about looking for the why is it's a good thing to start, and then we need to move on. So we look for the whys. What's going on? Did our child get enough to eat today? Is it the kind of weather they don't like? Is it the end of the week and they're always a little more wrung out? Are there other things going on in the world? Have I been a little more distracted? Are we serving hamburgers tonight and they don't like hamburgers? All of these things can be a why. What we do know is when a child is dysregulated, that they're dysregulated. That is a fact. And sometimes what I ask parents is, if you knew the reason why, would it change the way you approach it? In other words, if you have a child who is kicking a younger sibling, if they told you why, would it change how you felt about the kicking? Sometimes the answer is yes. You might be more patient with a whiny child if you knew they were coming down with a cold or if you knew they had a fight with their best friend. Sometimes it wouldn't matter. If a child was kicking a sibling, even if they had an argument with a best friend, it would be reasonable to say, I understand you're upset, but you cannot kick your brother, right? So let's think about what we are trying to figure out with the why. Are we trying to figure out a justification so that we can address it? Are we trying to figure out a problem so we can solve it? Are we trying to figure out an excuse so we'll be more patient? An explanation, I guess, instead of an excuse. Let's just say your child has a right to be dysregulated. No matter what happens, we're all allowed to feel how we feel. But that doesn't excuse certain behavior. So that's part of that. That includes anxious kids. Even if you are anxious, you may not kick your brother. Even though you are scared and worried, you cannot call me a big fat stupid head or whatever kind of kid cussing they do when they're upset with you. We can look at the big picture why, make sure that they're safe and sound, and still start addressing that anxious behavior, still holding limits. And one of the reasons for this is whatever else is going on, we need to be a strong, predictable, safe container. Now, this does not mean that we come down with both feet on a kid who is struggling. It does mean we provide them with the consistency and the expectations that our household is a safe household. Now, holding that safe container does not mean punishment. It does not mean telling the kid that they're going to get what for. It does mean consequences, and consequences, again, not punishment, mean things that we put in place so people are safe. All right? For example, a child who is anxious or worried or having a bad day and is kicking their sibling needs to be protected. The sibling needs to be protected. The younger sibling or the older sibling or the dog or you, whoever is the target, needs to be protected. The child who is behaving in a way that is out of control and harmful also needs to be protected from being their worst selves. Because lots of kids, if they are allowed to kick and hurt and say mean things, start thinking of themselves as people who kick and hurt and say mean things, as people who are rotten. Because generally speaking, most of us are not really proud of ourselves when we harm those that we love, even though we might be really mad at them. So consequences protect the person who is the target and also protects the child who is acting out. The other thing about asking why with kids is they don't always know why. I mean, think about it. We don't always know why we're in a bad mood. We can sometimes count backwards and go, okay, I guess this is annoying and this is annoying. And the truth is, I'm having a bad day and I'm in a bad mood. And we're adults with fully developed brains and capacity for language and insight and awareness that kids simply don't have. And when we ask them why, we may be asking them to put words to a whole bunch that's going on that they don't know. This is why sometimes when parents say, "Why did you do that?" and the kid says, "I don't know," and the parent gets frustrated, they really don't know. They don't know. They took the extra cookie because it was there. They tripped their brother because it came to them to do that. They threw away their homework instead of finishing it because they're impulsive and they didn't like the homework and they threw it away before they thought, how am I going to explain this? Kids do things because they're learning how to operate in the world. They do things, they don't always know the reason. They're anxious and they don't always know why. Especially those generalized anxious kids do not know why, they just feel anxious. And when we press them, but why are you anxious? Why don't you want to go to school? Why don't you want to go to that play date? They may come up with reasons that are actually not connected, but just kind of make sense in their head. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't check in with them. How are things going? Do you like your teacher? Are you feeling pretty comfortable in that level of math class? Whatever. But if your child continuously is just struggling with anxiety, let's just know it's because they're anxious. Again, check in, but we don't have to ask why every time to address the anxiety. In fact, the asking why is a form of us getting stuck in a parenting pitfall, which says If you have a good enough reason and a clear enough reason, I can fix the reason. Instead, we can say, I know that you're anxious. Which part of this is hard? How can I help you go towards it? How can I help you continue to do it? Again, I'm not saying ignore all the background. I'm saying have that conversation in other ways, in other forms, not just in the face of anxiety. There is a final reason for this. When we continue with the whys, what's going on for you? Tell me more. Only in the context of anxious behavior, dysregulated behavior, struggling behavior, we are training our child. If you want to have that connection with me, that intimate conversation, things need to be going badly. You need to be struggling. I tell this story often. When I was a preschool teacher and the kids were having a hard time, I would have a conversation with them because that is how I work with kids is through conversation. It's how I parented my kids. And I had to be careful with too much conversation and not enough action and intervention. So I've got these 3-year-olds, and every time somebody was bad, they would have a little sit down with me to talk about how we needed them to behave in a different way, whatever. And there was one little boy who really started acting up, and this was a sweetheart of a boy, and we couldn't figure it out. What was going on for him? Something at home going on? Something going on with one of the kids who'd moved up from the toddler class into our class? Was he worried about moving up into the pre-K class? What's going on? And then we found out because he did something. The other teacher pulled him aside, and he said, with his big grin on his adorable little face, "Oh, do I get to talk to Dawn now?" And then we realized we had been rewarding him. He needed more attention and intimate discussion. He needed that connection. And we had inadvertently taught him that he would get that one on one time if he did something that was against the preschool class rules. So I want you to think about that too. Are you finding other ways to connect with your child that aren't just about struggle and challenge and sadness and fear? And I will add here, it is really common that we start connecting with our kids a whole lot that way when anxiety comes out. And this is the patterns, okay? This is the patterns. It's nobody's fault. Your child's struggling. Of course, you start tuning in. You start really focusing on, let's get you through that struggle. We begin checking in with them on the daily. How is that struggle going? How are you doing today? What about tomorrow? Are you prepared for tomorrow's struggle? And suddenly our relationship is about the struggle. Part of what we do when we're working together is I help you find the ways to detach from the struggle and connect in more positive ways that can help move your child through the anxiety. This is a big, complicated topic. And of course, these are really short podcasts. And this is a very general look at things that are very individual. They are very based on development. They are very based on what's going on for you and your child. But I hope this might give you some places to look at what might be happening in your family. If you have a question for the Child Anxiety Fact podcast, go to my site, childanxietysupport.com/podcast, and you can post your question there. I look forward to hearing from you.